My name is Bruce Sewick, for those of you that don't know me. I run two clinical programs at a community mental health center, Leiden Family Service in Franklin Park. And this is one of the many presentations kind of going around the country on psychedelics, a lot of interest in it. So what I'm going to be doing is presenting kind of the clinical part. I'm going to be talking about specifically how psychedelics is used to treat addictions, and can be used to treat addictions based on past and proposed research that hopefully will come to pass. And I'm also going to talk about how drugs like these can improve mental health, which is kind of not treating it from a pathological point of view, but looking at it as kind of a mental enhancement. So we'll do a little conversation about that, and I'm going to start off with a video by Dr. Grob, who's done a lot of the psychedelic research and talking about the use of psychedelics to treat addiction. Okay.
I could also refer then to therapeutic research in general with psychedelics, or at least some studies that came out of the 60s, some of the limited studies that are being conducted currently, identify what might have been therapeutic about these individuals' experience. For instance, one of the most impressive areas of psychiatric research with psychedelics back in the 50s and 60s was work with hardcore alcoholics. For instance, the work of Humphrey Osmond up in Saskatchewan, Canada, where he took individuals who were refractory to all conventional treatments, had terribly severe alcoholism, administered one high dose, either LSD or mescaline session, and then followed up some years later to look at outcomes. He roughly broke his subjects into three groups, about the same in number. 1/3 of those people had really not had much positive effect at all. 1/3 had maintained sobriety for a period of time and then relapsed, and another third maintained sobriety over the entire period of follow-up. And he then looked to determine what might the variables have been, which could have distinguished one group or predicted one group from the other. And he found that although the group that did well for a period of time and then relapsed may have had beautiful aesthetic experience, powerful autobiographic experience, but it ended there. The people who maintained the long-term sobriety, the best outcomes, certainly had the aesthetic experience, they had the powerful autobiographic, reflective experience, but they also had something else. They had a very powerful psychospiritual experience, a transpersonal experience, a mystico-mimetic experience, a spiritual epiphany. And in a sense, they pointed to that as, in a sense, being curative, which then really harkens back to what William James once said. William James, the great founder of American psychology from the early 1900s, he once said about alcoholism, which he quaintly referred to as dipsomania, he said, the best treatment for dipsomania is religiomania. So I feel that what we observed with the UDV, the UDV Church, which uses ayahuasca as their sacrament, that it was this powerful psychospiritual, epiphanous experience, which may in fact have had a very powerful impact, helping individuals to, in a sense, realign their lives, realign and go pull back from the path they were on, which was leading to ruin and hardship and unfortunate premature demise, to a path which was a more harmonious, balanced, happier, healthier, and more successful path.
Yeah, almost like they were looking for meaning in the wrong place or in the wrong way.
Absolutely. And of course, we have, the persistent dilemma through Western civilization for century after century after century has been just that, has been individuals, addicted to a variety of compounds, particularly alcoholism, trying to somehow gain meaning from their experience, somehow transcend their life circumstances, but doing so in a highly maladaptive and counterproductive way.
So it's kind of interesting that Dr. Grob talked about psychedelics as being, I believe, and it's the first time I've heard the word, mystico-mimetic. Now, one of the terms that was originally used for psychedelics was psychotomimetic, which means it mimics psychosis. And now you have Dr. Grob talking about psychedelics as mystico-mimetic, meaning they mimic a mystical experience. So you see the transition that's happening in culture that the three of us feel is going to be a step to having psychedelics accepted by culture, by the present culture. So I want to talk about the psychedelics as a transpersonal approach. I want to talk about treating addictions and also for mental health. Let's start off by talking about the way psychedelics can be used to treat addictions. But in order to do that, and Dr. Roberts talked about it, we need to understand what is meant by transpersonal, because I feel that this type of therapy is a very transpersonal therapy. When we talk about transpersonal, we're talking about something that transcends the self. That's basically looking at the big picture, seeing the universe. It encompasses a wider aspect of mankind. So it transcends the, as Alan Watts would call it, the ego, the skin-encapsulated ego. So that's basically what we're talking about. Addiction is looked at in this country as a response to a drug, but it is actually a response to a life experience. Now, one of the more interesting experiments that I've come across is something that took place in 1981 by a gentleman named Bruce Alexander, and it's referred to as Rat Park, and it's one of my favorite studies. And what the research was going on at that time and continues is you put a rat in a small cage and you give it an opportunity to self-administer an opiate. And the rat self-administers an opiate. It becomes addicted, not interested in the daily activities of life, and can even go on to death. Stop eating, will just continue to self-administer opiate to no good end. So what Bruce Alexander did was he took and he built a cage that was 200 times the size of the typical rat cage used for the research. And he put rats of opposite sex together and little rat toys, and even painted a mural on the back of what he called Rat Park. And what he found was that when you gave those rats the opportunity to self-administer an opiate, they didn't, for the most part, because the environment provided a stimulus, and they had plenty going on in their natural life that they weren't reduced to using an opiate to kind of withdraw from life. And then he took it a step further. What he did was he addicted rats, he got them addicted to opiates, and then he put them back into two different experimental designs. And I think it was every 9 days, I forget what the interval was, they had an opportunity to choose whether they would self-administer the opiate. And again, what he found here was that the rats that were in Rat Park were less likely to self-administer an opiate. So he was very taken aback by this, because this kind of flew in the eyes of what the current theory on addiction was. And of course, nobody was interested in the research. The research was all about all drugs are bad, all drugs lead to addiction, all drugs can kill, and nobody was interested in Rat Park. But it's kind of had a resurgence as of late. So he came to a couple of conclusions. It's not about a demon drug that makes the addiction, because basically the research was about trying to coax rats into becoming and using drugs. And what they found was that it was the environment and the isolation of the rats that caused it to want to do that. given a chance to live in a normal environment, rat park, the rats weren't very interested. They had a little bit of appetite for opiate drugs. So the conclusion here was that the drug usage was more about the physical, emotional, and environmental setting, which kind of places the onus on society to go about treating that, to look at the environments when you're talking about treating drug addiction. This is the entire cartoon version of the experiment, which is pretty good. So you think about the way the theory about addiction reinforces the war on drugs, because if it's all about drugs causing addiction, then the way to end the addiction is to interdict the drugs. So you cut off the flow of drugs, and then the addiction rate decreases. But as we all know, or maybe some of you don't, the war on drugs has been a big failure. What it does is it warehouses people to the extent that we're the largest incarceration nation in the country. Almost 2.5 million people in jail, a big spike because of the war on drugs. So we don't treat the problem, we warehouse people in cages that are like the rat cages instead of treatment. So Bruce Alexander took this theory further some years later, 20 years later, in his book, The Globalization of Addiction. And what he hypothesizes, and has in his mind proven it, is that when you're dislocated from society, when you don't feel plugged into society, that's when you're apt to become an addict. What he found by examining various historical periods of time in various parts of the world were when the people felt plugged into society, there was less addiction in that particular society. So the dislocation from society is also caused by, in the Western terms, the free market philosophy, this unrelenting pressure to buy things, to have a car, to have the right watch, to have the right house. So it causes pressure towards individualism and competition, and basically it encourages addictive habits, things that are immediately reinforced. So he feels that that sets the stage for addiction by having a society that is driven by the free market paradigm. The term addiction was not moralistic when it was first used. The term addiction was not linked to alcohol or drugs. It originally referred to a surrender to anyone or to a master or any kind of state of or habit that you would pursue in the sense of being addicted. So that's the way addiction was used. But during the temperance movement, this changed, and the term addiction took on a different meaning. Addiction indicated a moral failure, and the medical profession started using it as a way to describe a disease. So the term addiction changed to indicate that it's a moral failure. So you see this kind of shift in the paradigm. So the official view of addiction is that drug addiction is an individual problem. Okay, it's progressive and it's relapsing. It's not curable. It can only be controlled by professional intervention. Basically, drug plus person equals addiction. That's the formula that this is predicated on. And what that implies is that addiction is a drug problem, which brings us back to the war on drugs, which fuels a lot of jobs and is a big industry. So viewing it, as I said, as the result of a demon drug, reinforces the war on drugs, which is all about interdiction over treatment, when in essence, addiction is usually adaptive for the addict. So where am I going with this? The next couple of slides are going to be from Dr. Gabor Mate, who was working with addicts in Canada and was also using some psychedelics in treatment. Addiction may not be a natural state of mind, but the parts of the brain that it subverts are part of our central machinery of survival. That's kind of key here. There is no single identified center for addiction in the brain. Instead, there's 4 major networks. You have the opioid apparatus, which basically is the pleasure component of the addiction. So when you want it and you use it and you use, then it's a consummation of drug seeking. Then you've got the dopamine system that is about motivating the addict to continue use. Self-regulation system in the cortex, this is what gets hijacked when the person is addicted. The drug addiction disrupts the circuits that control and inhibit behavior. And then finally, you have the stress response mechanism, which is the 4th part of the addictive process. So let's look at the opioid apparatus. The endorphins are essentially what I'm talking about. These are the body's endogenous opiates. You're all familiar with endorphins, so it's what you have in your body that makes you feel good. These endorphins serve as messengers in our body. They're the chemical catalysts for experiencing the key emotions in our life. Endorphins and plant-derived opioids, so the internal stuff that we produce and also the external stuff that we can get from the plants, are very powerful soothers of physical and emotional pain. And they work. And if you're a behaviorist like I am, if something works, you're going to keep doing it. So if you're emotionally distraught, if you have some physical pain, and you can get immediate relief from it, and you can turn to endorphins or opioids. You've read or maybe heard about, or you maybe even know people that cut. Why do people cut? Why do people self-mutilate? It's because it releases the endorphins, which is soothing. So you see that as a response to a life stressor. Also, the endorphins are part of the bonding between the mother and the infant. This loving response that takes place between the two actually floods the brain with endorphins. And children that have not received this kind of attention from their parents are at greater risk to seek chemical satisfaction. So if you're not getting your needs met endogenously, then the tendency would be to turn to the external for that. And in that, you have to realize that the brain undergoes the most critical development in children in the first 36 months. So that's another key here. So that opioid apparatus that I'm talking about provides the entry point for narcotics in our body. And basically, the less effective our internal chemical system is, the more apt we are, the more driven we are to seek joy and relief through drug taking or other compulsive behaviors that we perceive as rewarding. The second part of the addiction process is dopamine. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter that initiates reward-seeking activities. Dopamine is released in the nucleus accumbens, which sets off excitement and elation and reinforces and causes repetitive behavior. Environmental cues trigger dopamine. So if you are an addict, if you like coffee, and you drive past a Dunkin' Donuts, you start getting the dopamine release because your body is thinking, aha, this is something that I can get. So it starts this movement toward satiation here. So it's most active during the establishment of addictive behaviors. The self-regulation system that goes haywire requires development of the brain's self-regulation circuits. So you have to be in tune with your emotional state, and if you're not, that's problematic. What happens is that repeated drug use leads to long-lasting changes in the brain that impacts and undermines the voluntary control mechanism that we're talking about here. And then when the brain is impaired and the addictive behavior is in its middle stage, there's the pattern there of impaired rational decision-making and also this diminished impulse regulation results from this. And where does this take place? It takes place in the orbitofrontal cortex near the eye socket. This is responsible for the impairment. It regulates emotion processing and how we react behaviorally to emotion. It participates in the substance dependence when self-regulation system is impaired, this hijacking that I talked about. And then what happens is addicts are tricked into valuing false wants above real needs, because then all their wants are reduced to one need, and that's where can I get the next fix or whatever it is you're addicted to. So in a sense, it kind of simplifies life, because then it's all about getting the drug. And that, by the way, is called salience attribution. So in general, it's all about the stimulus input that we're talking about, either good or bad. Stimulus wires the brain circuitry as the child develops. That's why, crawling around, all the exploring, putting things in their mouth, all this is about developing the brain circuitry. And what can stimulate the brains could be addictive drugs, which is bad stimulation, or a lack of good stimulation, which causes a problem too, as I talked about earlier. Now this gives you an idea of Rat Park. The Bruce Alexander experiment in 1981 that I talked about, that's Rat Park. And to the right of it are the cages that were used that reinforced that demon drugs is what causes the problem. They look a lot to me like the high-rise projects we had in Chicago, and that didn't work. So the emotional nurturing that can take place in the environment, the maternal bond that I talked about, is absolutely essential for human brain development. And living in a place like this, or putting people in a place like that for using drugs, which is what the jails look like, to me doesn't really solve the problem. So human connections create the neuronal systems that are involved in the brain systems involved in addiction. The brain is experience dependent. The absence of good experience, as I've said, or also the presence of bad experiences. So what does that mean? And again, where am I heading with this? Different experiences can affect the brain, the development of the brain, including the reduction of the ability to inhibit self-destructive behaviors, which takes place during addiction. Drugs can then take the place of these missing neuronal connections. They can take and satisfy what the person is looking for, and especially consider the stimulus-restricted environments. Think back to Rat Park, the fact that he had a hard time getting the rats to addict to opiates when they were stimulated naturally using natural reinforcement. Stress and trauma can also be a factor. This is the fourth part, because the brain is, if the developed brain is triggered into stress responses frequently, it gets preset to this response. And then the brain is likely to assign a higher value to substances, activities, and situations that provide short-term relief and bring the person back to homeostasis, back to where they feel that they're kind of in the middle there. So addiction then is a deeply ingrained response to stress. If you think about it, it basically is using self-soothing to cope, self-soothing to cope. So this is a way that the addict copes with life's experiences. Also, when we talk about stress, the stress is passed on from the mother through the placenta to the growing fetus, which can also program a predisposition to addiction. What happens then is the dopamine receptors that I talked about earlier that cause this repetitive behavior are lacking in dopamine, and it results in craving for dopamine, which causes the person later on to initiate activities that best and quickly releases dopamine into the system, and this becomes the object of the addictive pursuit. So my question, and the psychedelic part of the equation, is, can you provide a corrective experience for addicts that could be a new template moving forward? Well, we talked about some of the earlier research that was done, and some of the earlier research showed that LSD as a therapeutic adjunct to treat alcoholics suggested it was possible. Now, the way this was stumbled upon was the original researchers using LSD thought if they triggered an artificial delirium tremens that alcoholics experience when they hit bottom, they might cause them to stop using. But what happened was they accidentally gave them a transcendental mystical experience, and they found a reduction in alcohol use sometimes after one session. So that was kind of like a not intended consequence that resulted in a lot of research at that time. There was a large conference, and there were many conferences back in the 60s on the use of LSD in psychotherapy and alcoholism, and this took place in May of 1965, and papers from all over the world were submitted. A lot of those papers were written with CIA support. A lot of the funding was funded by the CIA because the CIA was very interested in psychedelics as mind-controlled drugs, and still are. So what they found in looking at this research that people were reporting all over the world was that the best predictor of abstinence was a transcendental experience. It wasn't the LSD itself, but it was the experience that the person had facilitated by LSD, which is what's caused the corrective emotional experience. Okay, so it was the mystical experience that was a side effect of ingesting LSD that caused the abstinence. Some patients felt that their lives had more value and meaning. Some felt as if they had been reborn and were able to reconstruct their self-image. Many of them gained insight into their maladaptive behavior. And in some of the indigenous cultures that use hallucinogens, take the Native American culture, peyote and the peyote ceremony is considered an intervention for alcoholism by the Department of Human Services, because part of the peyote lifestyle and the insight that the practitioners of the peyote religion get is insight into their addiction, and it is one of the things that works consistently with alcoholics. And not surprisingly, societies that accept or have psychedelics as part of the culture see less incidences of addiction. So for instance, in Brazil, where they have the ayahuasca churches, they find less incidence of addiction because there's a socially sanctioned way to alter your consciousness. Kind of interesting. Our social way to alter your consciousness is to drink coffee or to drink alcohol, right? Or smoke cigarettes. That's kind of the socially sanctioned way to do it. So in 2012, a meta-analysis of 6 single-dose LSD treatments were looked at, and it was a total of 536 adults. This is a single dose. 59% of the LSD patients were improved versus 38% in the control arm, so those that didn't get LSD. There were significant treatment effects up to 6 months, but not up to 12, which merely indicates that there should maybe be some booster sessions from time to time. It's no different than therapy. If you go to see a therapist, you get some relief. Something happens again, you go back for therapy. Not unusual, not any new paradigm. So it suggests the need for potentially repeated dosing. So the question I ask is, can a psychedelic experience provide insight and help fill this spiritual emotional void that previously manifested itself as addictive behavior? In Dr. Roberts' book, he quoted Grinspoon and Bachelor in 1979, said, "It is assumed that, as it is often said, one traumatic event can shape a life and one therapeutic event can reshape it." Now, I don't think any therapist would disagree with that. But the question is, what if we had a way to consistently create that environment? As I said, the natural source of psychedelic drugs have been used by indigenous cultures for centuries with no reported problems. As I said, this is in a restricted setting, controlled, happens, in ayahuasca churches, I believe it happens twice a month. So people aren't using it recreationally, and again, less use of substances and addiction. So what happens in a psychedelic state is you end up with a temporary altered state that in the right setting can result in a very deep, meaningful religious experience, this mystical mimetic thing that Charles Grob talked about. So that can happen under the influence. And the psychedelic experience itself can be divided up into, and this is Jim Fadiman's, the way he describes it, into 3 general doses. You have the high dose, which facilitates this transpersonal experience that I talked about. So in a high dose, you can facilitate this transpersonal feeling, and where you see yourself as part of the universe and your relationship with all living things. In moderate doses, it becomes kind of more of a reflection about your personality, the psychodynamic structures of your own individual consciousness. And then in low doses, and this is part of some of the research that Jim Fadiman did, they facilitate awareness of solutions to technical and artistic problems. It's a pretty well-known fact that the computer industry was fueled by the psychedelics that were being used on the West Coast. So that's kind of how it can be used to facilitate a mystical experience. But what happens if you're working with people that are in that are having a psychedelic bad trip or kind of a spiritual emergency? Now, I have assisted the psychedelic community by people find out about me by Googling my name, and I've assisted people that have had a bad trip, the proverbial bad trip. Did too many drugs, didn't understand it, took too much at one time. So what we're talking about here is the proverbial bad trip. Clients are unable to integrate their experience successfully, and that is what has been known as a flashback. A flashback is just the inability to integrate the experience. So you can have flashbacks about times in your life, and you probably all do, about things that you've not been able to successfully integrate. So that it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. Feeling of fragmentation and dissociation, that can be likened to a psychotic break. Also feelings of anxiety and paranoia, and delusions of reference, and then in extreme cases, potentially some suicidal ideation. So what I'm going to be talking about now is based on my personal experience going out in the community and working with people that are having a bad trip. I also, as part of my job, work with people that are fairly psychotic, and there's some similarities in how you treat that. And I think that is something that mental health professionals have to be aware of, because it's something that is not too often talked about. I've also, using some personal conversations I've had with Jim Fadiman, who is a proponent of having guides to help with the experiences that I'm talking about, spiritual and or psychedelic emergencies. So this is an actual quote of somebody that I was working with over the phone. He had gone to a party, 3 days of psychedelics, whatever he could take, he took, which is not a good idea. And he said the toughest thing is the depersonalization. It's hard to operate in life when it feels like you're walking around dead. The thing to realize is, much like a spiritual crisis, spiritual crises have initiated some religions. You have Jesus in a desert. Muhammad was being spoken to by an angel. So these things occur naturally and are not looked upon as being unusual. So it's important to convey to the person that is in this crisis that it is not unusual, that is basically important, and it could be a healing event, something that could be used to heal, and is not as unusual as the person might think. People tend to compress these experiences into whatever their spiritual framework is, be it Christian or Buddhist. So that happens. So from a perspective of mental health workers, how do we approach working with people that are in this, in having a spiritual or a psychedelic crisis? You need to have a wide range of concepts that include the transpersonal experiences that I alluded to. It's important not to impose your own conceptual framework on the situation. When I started in the field, I was a respite worker, and I remember sitting around in a clinical meeting, and the other respite workers were talking about the misinformation they were giving kids, thinking they would scare them out of the use of drugs. Things like LSD will make your brain bleed. These are not the kind of things that you tell kids, because the time that they would do that, they would remember that. So that's unethical, and I reminded the people in that room that we were supposed to be clinicians trying to heal people, not to make them sicker and kind of embarrass them. So not to impose your own value system and your concepts on the person in the situation. Again, you use it as an opportunity to heal rather than look at it as pathological. So you work with the experience and not try to suppress it. Because oftentimes what happens is the first thing, and it's the same thing for psychosis, is the first thing that happens is they stop the psychotic break, right? So it's the attempt sometimes to suppress it means that it's not going to go away because it's unresolved. You're going to end up with a perpetual flashback. Also to create a safe and supportive environment for the person that you're working with, and put it in the context of a deep personal transformation. So the general guidelines to keep in mind is that the content of the experience needs to be accepted and worked on, not denied. You can help the person see if this links back to their life situation. Help the person to calm down, remind them that this is a time-limited thing. So the drug's effect has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So it's a short-term thing that will end. So that is looking at psychedelics to treat a condition. How about looking at psychedelics potentially from a mental health perspective? In the book Spiritual Growth with Entheogens, Roger Walsh talks about why it is so difficult to kind of shift the paradigm, or why it has been difficult to look at psychedelics as something that would altered state as being something that would viably enhance personal development. One, is it the lack of research? Well, that's not true. In the early 70s, there were over 1,000 studies done on psychedelics. And the current research that has started actually in the early 1990s still continues with no problems. Are there any risks? Yes, there are. There are risks if used unprofessionally. We're talking about supervised, controlled setting, and we're talking about pure psychedelic drugs. We're not talking about street drugs. We're not talking about ecstasy. We're talking about MDMA. We're not talking about street acid. We're talking about pharmaceutical LSD. So there is a difference between what is being used in the research and what's out in the street. So given that, and given the fact that the clients are screened, the incidence of severe adverse reactions is less than 1%. And in the normal population, it's even less than that. Cultural misunderstanding. The psychedelic drugs were sensationalized in the 70s. There were stories about chromosome damage, which turned out not to be true, about kids taking LSD, staring into the sun and burning their retina. Other people thought they could fly and jumped off buildings. So these stories created this hysteria, and then it was also associated with the counterculture movement, which is part of the 70s. And there's no distinction made between psychedelic drugs and drugs of addiction. Most medical experts will say that LSD and psilocybin are not considered drugs of addiction. MDMA doesn't exactly fall into that category. Transient benefits. The only way we're going to know if this works is to do the research. You heard Bob Wold talk about if it wasn't for the psychedelic story, there might not be this path to cure for cluster headaches. So there's ample reasons to continue the research. We're talking about altered consciousness, which is kind of problematic. Western science does not recognize altered states of consciousness as legitimate. They're considered to be self-indulgent, escapist, and potentially they could indicate a mental illness, could be symptoms of a mental illness. Western psychiatry itself is biased in two ways. It's ethnocentric because what the psychiatric science, what psychiatrists don't understand, is attributed to superstitious or psychotic behavior. It's also cognocentric, which means only the ordinary state of consciousness is of value. And the political issues that I referred to, psychedelics have a bad rap. You had Timothy Leary talking about turn on, tune in, drop out. You had the association with the anti-war movement. So it got a very bad rap that lasted for some decades. The association with subversive qualities, that it would turn somebody into a long-haired, not free market using hippie, which is, remember, Bruce Alexander talked about in the globalization of addiction. So it's the antithesis of what he was talking about. Also, it could engender a questioning of accepted beliefs and can threaten established societal norms and cultural norms. So what's needed is an approach that looks at an altered state as a legitimate mind-body state, as Dr. Roberts talks about, and then uses this shift in paradigm as an opportunity to change old learning patterns through self-insight. Remember that many of the alcoholics in those single-dose experiments stopped for a period of time just after one session. So this change in perception can get somebody to change on a dime. The Western religion is more about a belief system than an experiential one. One of my favorite quotes that Jung has said was that one of the functions of mainstream religion is to protect people against the direct experience of God. Whereas some of the ancient technologies used altered states as a way to make yourself better, to have better mental health, and healthy personality development. So psychedelic research can test these hypotheses because depending on the dose, it can reliably result in an altered state, and then you can further test these hypotheses. So in conclusion, I feel that psychedelics can positively influence society in a biopsychosocial spiritual domain. In a biological way, you heard Bob Wold talk about cluster headaches and serotonergic hallucinogens. Psychologically, it can be used to impact thoughts, emotions, and behavior, and to change behaviors, as we saw with addictions. Socially, it can enhance interpersonal cohesion and then help reintegrate the person back into the community. And spiritually, it can enhance the spiritual orientation. Little eye candy for the end. So I appreciate you coming here. Does anybody have any questions? I know that somebody talked about autism. There is some talk about developing a protocol to treat autism. It's not that it would cure it, but take MDMA, for example, the characteristics of MDMA. It's called an empathogen or an impactogen. It helps people feel empathy for others, and that's one of the symptoms of autism. So it'd probably be used for like adult Asperger's syndrome, but it takes time and money, and they were soliciting some anecdotal stories to see if they could initiate that. Does anybody have any questions? Yes. So the question is there been any research on using it to treat people that are having positive symptoms of mental illness? Yes, there was, and some of it was somewhat profound, but it was rather limited. So it was because when you think about it, psychedelics are antipsychotics. So, I mean, I think there'd be a long time before you would see that happening. Right now, it's being used to treat PTSD, end-of-life depression and anxiety. There's some talk about using ketamine. You've read that to treat depression. So it's not to that part yet, but it's kind of moving in many directions. And again, it's kind of time and money. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much. We anticipate having another one in November. Like I said, I teach a class here twice a year, once on campus and once online. So if you are interested, come see me. Thank you.